Να σας καλησπερίσω από τη Λευκοσία. Είμαστε εδώ περίπου πάνω από 15 άτομα για την 5η συνάντηση του Βυζαντινού Σεμιναρίου. Σήμερα απόψε έχουμε την τιμή και τη χαρά να έχουμε μαζί μας τον καθηγητή Γιούν Ρίτσαρτ από το Calvin College του Michigan, και να μας μιλήσει για το δικό του έργο της ζωής του, που είναι ο Άγιος Επιφάνιος Σαλαμίνας. Ο τίτλος της σημερινής ομιλίας του είναι Snakes and Scorpions, Hunting the Dehumanized Heretic in Late Antiquity. Ο κ. Γιούν θα μιλήσει στα αγγλικά. Φέτος βρίσκεται στην Κύπρο για έναν ολόκληρο χρόνο ως Fulbright Visiting Researcher, Scholar, και για να ολοκληρώσει την ίδια τη μελέτη πάλι για τον Άγιο Επιφάνιο Σαλαμίνας. Από ό,τι βλέπω έχουμε 16 τηλεπαρόντες. Υπάρχει λοιπόν μια ισορροπία σήμερα μεταξύ τηλεπαρόντων και φυσικά παρόντων. Αυτά για την ώρα των μέλα. Ο λόγος στον καθηγητή εκεί.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Καλησπέρα σας. Λυπάμαι δεν μπορώ να μιλάω στη ελληνικά, so I have to speak in English. I thought maybe I would begin my paper in Korean, but I think that would be even harder for people to understand, so I will stick with English. And if I speak too quickly, please let me know, and I can slow down, because my tendency is to speak naturally as it comes to me, so please let me know. But I want to thank Professor Fimianis and Delegianakis for this opportunity to share my research, and I hope we can have some interesting time of discussion afterward. Okay, so I shall begin. Epiphanius of Cyprus was many things to many people, past and present. To his admirers, he was an ascetic exemplar, venerable pastor and bishop, capable administrator, defender of the Orthodox faith, biblical scholar, and heresy hunter. Well after his death in 403, his reputation and legacy for holiness and orthodoxy resulted in the composition of a hagiography, the establishment of a cult site in the ancient city of Salamis on Cyprus, and the continued celebration, even to the present, of his feast day on May 12th. Jerome, a contemporary of Epiphanius and a friend and ally during the Origenist controversy of the late 4th century, included the Cypriot bishop in his catalogue of illustrious men, and he preserved several anecdotes in his other writings that epitomized Epiphanius' popularity. For example, during an episode in which Epiphanius was visiting the city of Jerusalem, Jerome wrote how, quote, a crowd of all ages and both sexes was flocking together to him, offering their little ones, warmly kissing his feet, plucking at the fringes of his clothes. The 5th century ecclesiastical historian Sozomenos simply concluded, quote, hence I think he is entirely the most famous man under heaven, so to speak, end quote. While it is certainly difficult to separate fact from fiction, nevertheless the hagiographical memory of Epiphanios echoed the extent of his popularity and reputation during his own lifetime. Among contemporary scholars, Italian theologian Calogero Righi stands out for his many publications on various aspects of the life and work of Epiphanios, and for the esteem with which he held Il Santo di Salamina. In the bulk of his work, Professor Righi acknowledged the negative contemporary perceptions of Epiphanius, but at the same time, his own interpretations consistently demonstrated an underlying sense of reverence and admiration for the Bishop of Cyprus. More recently, the 2003 monograph-length study and commentary on the Ankorathos, on the writing by Epiphanios, by German historian Oliver Küstlers, offers a balanced portrayal of Epiphanios as a pastor, biblical scholar, and a bishop whose overarching concern was soteriological and whose rigidly dogmatic persona became manifest when he perceived that the Orthodox faithful were under attack. To his detractors and critics, Epiphanios was a narrow-minded zealot, a divisive meddler, and subpar scholar, with a penchant for harsh rhetoric and invective. Bishop John of Jerusalem, unjustly accused by the Archbishop of Cyprus of being an Origenist, thought of Epiphanios as, quote, a vainglorious old man. The 9th century patriarch and bibliophile Photius did not think very highly of Epiphanios as a writer. Quote, his style is poor and of such a level as is proper of one who is not guided by Attic elegance, end quote, which is certainly a sentiment that has carried over into modern assessments. Because of Epiphanios' seeming intransigence and dogmatic obstinacy, scholars generally have maintained a rather negative perception of him. Richard Hanson once described him as, quote, another second-rate theologian standing in the tradition of Athanasius, and a writer who is narrow-minded at best and very silly at worst. Frank Williams offered the following judgment, quote, it is Epiphanios' inflated self-esteem which renders him least attractive. It is clear that he considered his own scholarship superior to most, and his own word on any question of importance decisive. Once he had pronounced, nothing need be added, nor was he given to regarding his opponents with respect, end quote. In addition to the defects in his personality, Epiphanios also involved himself in a number of ecclesiastical affairs in which he seems to have overestimated and overstepped his authority and appeared the aggressor. And finally, Epiphanios' shortcomings and character flaws were further magnified by the fact that he was contemporary of some of the greatest minds in the patristic tradition. Quote, in fact, Epiphanios seems to be a complete stranger to classical paideia, and is, in this regard, a unique exception among the grand authors of his age. The sheer brilliance of these illumined men, the Cappadocian Fathers, John Chrysostomos, Jerome, and Augustine, to name a few, and the productivity of their pens have far outshone the lonely bishop from Cyprus and his awkward, bulky, and verbose writing. My research, which I have conducted over the past 7 months under the generosity of the Cyprus Fulbright Commission, approaches Epiphanios with a balanced perspective, recognizing, extolling, and criticizing both his virtues and flaws, strengths and weaknesses, and have tried to situate him within the broader historical context of the late Roman world and late ancient Christianity. In doing so, I have argued that Epiphanios was not a minor figure and not someone who should be marginalized or dismissed as overzealous or part of the lunatic fringe. For my colleagues and students here who are less than familiar with Epiphanios, please allow me to provide some background to his life and work. Born around 315 in a small village in Palestine, Epiphanios spent his early years in Egypt training in asceticism and a lifestyle of a monk. Then, sometime in the late 330s, he returned to his homeland and founded a monastery over which he served as an abbot. In Palestine, he earned a reputation as a dedicated monk and for the defense of what he understood to be Orthodox Christianity. His theological views, including his affirmation of the correlative divinity of the Father and the Son, was by and large in the minority in the Greek East, and his convictions aligned with those of the oft-exiled Athanasius. Sometime around 367, Epiphanios received the call to assume the leadership of the churches on the island of Cyprus as the Metropolitan Bishop of Constantia, also known as Ancient Salamis, and he would remain in his position until his death in 403. His episcopal career was notable for two main facets, his literary output and his heresy hunting. His two main writings, both composed in the 370s, were respectively entitled the Ankoratos, which was a theological treatise dedicated primarily to a defense of the Trinity, and the Panarion, or medicine chest, a treatise in which he compiled and offered information on the beliefs, practices, and corresponding reputations of 80 different heresies. It is to this latter text we will return shortly. Apparently, Christians in the other parts of the Roman Empire trusted him and sought his theological expertise, as both of the aforementioned texts were composed in response to letters from communities outside of Cyprus, and we have in our possession other letters that requested his pronouncements on various theological and liturgical issues. As Archbishop of the island, Epiphanius involved himself in a number of theological and political controversies, which saw him travel to Antioch, Jerusalem, Rome, and Constantinople in pursuit of his Orthodox agenda. He counted among his allies Jerome and later Archbishop Theophilos of Alexandria, while his enemies, at least he perceived it, constituted a long list of heretics and heretical bishops who were either condemned for their Arian theology or for Origenism. He famously clashed with John of Jerusalem and John Chrysostomos at the end of his career. As a pro-Nicene bishop in the Greek East in the latter half of the 4th century, Epiphanius found himself in the midst of an uphill struggle, as even the main emperors of his day, and in his half of the empire, Constantius and Valens, were for all intents and purposes heretics according to Epiphanius' standard of orthodoxy. He would not have had access to the imperial court and potentially its power and authority, and thus his battle against heresy remained primarily in the realm of words and of rhetoric. Epiphanius envisioned his Panarion as a metaphorical box of remedies, a medicine chest containing cures against the poisons and venoms of heretics. The treatments that he provided were rooted in correct, decidedly non-allegorical exegesis of the Bible, and his readers could either shore themselves up with this knowledge as a defense against the threat of heresy, or they could use the medicines contained within to heal and restore those already afflicted by heresy. Quote, I accurately recount everything concerning each heresy, as I said, revealing horrible things for the sake of treatment for those who have fallen. And for the sake of refutation, I prepare a medicinal drug made from the divine scriptures and right reasonings, as I said, providing it in the Lord according to a twofold manner. For the sake of recovery for those going through sickness and great pain, and for the sake of a preventative remedy, as I said, for those who have not ever been infected. Giving the drug of the truth to the wise, may we also be called a disciple of the disciples of our Lord and Savior, who is the health of bodies and souls. End quote. This was a theme that undergirded the entire work, and Epiphanius portrayed himself as a sort of physician and pharmacist of the truth. However, equally important and indeed closely related to this medical theme was Epiphanius' self-identification with the naturalist tradition. And this is the first handout here. In one of the two prefaces to the Panarion, he referenced a laundry list of ancient naturalist writers, none of which he likely consulted directly, including the Hellenistic didactic poet Nicander. Epiphanius said that these authors wrote, quote, to frighten men and ensure their safety so that they would recognize terrible and deadly beasts, be safe, and escape them, end quote. And they also, quote, prescribed medicines made from roots and plants to cure the sickness caused by these serpents, end quote. Epiphanius then claimed that his own purpose was, quote, to expose the appearance of the terrible reptiles and beasts and their poisons and deadly bites, and to correspond with them, I shall provide an antidote to counteract their poison as much as I am able, in brief, with one or two arguments, in order to save any who so desire to be saved with the Lord, who, whether knowingly or not, have fallen into the snake-like teachings of these heresies. What we see here was the beginning of a very important process that unfolded in the entirety of the work, the blurring of the distinction between man and animal. And this distorted line of demarcation between human and beast served to create an entirely new taxonomy of heresy that categorized and stigmatized the heretical other. And I would argue that this, in turn, functioned to justify, at least rhetorically, a religious violence directed against these wild and dangerous heretics. Structurally, the first 20 entries of the Panarion were dedicated to heresies that existed before the incarnation of Christ, and included among them were various sects of Judaism and Greek philosophical schools. Indeed, Epiphanius, whose own education was not in the high traditions of Greek culture, disdained classical culture and believed the mingling of Christian theology and Greek philosophy was precisely the cause for the poison that was heresy. However, what we also find at work in the Phanarion was a subtle engagement and appropriation of classical knowledge, but reinterpreted to correspond and conform to a Christian view of the world. Most likely drawing from an epitomized handbook, Epiphanius appropriated classical naturalist knowledge, subsumed its didactic and defensive purposes, and reconfigured it to function within the discourse of orthodoxy and heresy. The transformation and Christianization of classical society and culture were quintessential processes of the period that we identify as late antiquity. Beginning with the 21st entry against the prime heresiarch Simon Magus, Epiphanius structured his entries with a basic pattern of introduction, exposition, refutation, and conclusion. The introductions often included biographical details of the founders of the heresies, and the expositions detailed the erroneous beliefs and practices of the heresies they established. The refutations, often quite tedious, comprised Epiphanius' rhetorical attacks against these beliefs and practices, rooted in his particular biblical exegesis. Finally, the conclusions were the opportunity for Epiphanius to punctuate the entries with the final word, and he regularly established direct links between the heretics and specific dangerous animals. By and large, the creatures Epiphanius identified were those found in the wilderness and away from the urban context of daily life. While the natural world could and did provide much that was good and beneficial for humanity, there also existed severe and often hidden dangers and threats. Thus, the wilderness, a place associated with the unbridled freedom and potential savagery of nature, was in many ways to be feared and avoided. Furthermore, the wilderness was the locus in which ascetic exemplars, like Antony, waged spiritual and physical warfare against demons who often appeared in the guise of wild animals. And just as poisonous creatures lay in waiting and threatened human well-being, in the same way heretics also set their traps and endangered the believer's theological health. Orthodoxy was preserved only in the safe and orderly confines of the church and its caretakers, and once a believer moved beyond the security of the church, he or she then became the potential prey of wild and dangerous heretics. However, the animals of the wilderness at times could penetrate the city and the ordered structures of human life, and they had to be removed or eliminated. Likewise, heretics had infiltrated the Holy Church, and it was up to its guardians to identify and expel them from the community. The comparison between wicked men and heretics to wild animals, especially serpents, was by no means new among Jews or Christians, and even Jesus himself did not shy away from identifying certain men with a brood of vipers and empowering his followers to, quote, tread on snakes and scorpions. But Epiphanius did not settle merely for stock associations and attacks. Rather, he took his rhetorical assaults a step further by equating very specific creatures and their unique behaviors with particular heretics and their distinctive errors. And I will discuss a few examples among the many that can be found in the Phanarion to highlight how Epiphanius rhetorically blurred the line between human and animal and implicitly advocated violence against heretics. First example, and this is the next slide. One of the most infamous entries was that dedicated to a group Epiphanius broadly identified as the Gnostics, but with the added name of the Borborites, meaning something like the filthy ones. In addition to explanations of their cosmology and theology, this entry was notorious for its description of the alleged lurid and grotesque rites and rituals of this group, which has led many modern readers to identify a libertine element in Gnostic Christianity. Epiphanios claimed to have had direct contact with certain members of this sect when he was in Egypt, and it seems he was even tempted to join them. Quote, "So those women who were teaching this enticing myth were most attractive in the outward form of their appearance, but had in their minds of depravity all the ugliness of the devil. But the merciful God rescued me from their depravity, so that after I read their books and came to know their true mind and was not carried away, I escaped and was not enticed." End quote. Whatever the truth of his claims, Epiphanius rhetorically augmented his authoritative knowledge of this heresy by claiming a personal encounter with them and a familiarity with their writings. These Gnostic heretics apparently engaged in cannibalism, consumption of menstrual and seminal fluid, and frequent orgies. Furthermore, Epiphanius was especially disturbed by the licentiousness and fornication of this heresy, especially their practice of ritual sex. The adherents of this heresy allegedly forbade insemination during their rituals, and the men carrying out the rites were said to withdraw before climax and to ejaculate instead into the dirt. The heretics would then eat the blend of dirt and semen as a type of Eucharistic host. If a woman happened to become pregnant, she would abort and remove the fetus, ground it with various spices, and ritually consume the mixture. Alarmed by the enticements of the alluring female members of this group, Epiphanius was even more shocked to find out that they could be found among the congregation of his local church community. So he, quote, "made haste to point them out to the bishops in that place, and to find out the names of those hidden in the church. And they were expelled from the city, about 80, and the city was purged of their tear-like and thorny growth." Because of their sexually depraved practices, Epiphanius compared the heretics to what he called a viper with no birth pangs. And this is from the selection above here. He informed us that when a male and female of this breed of viper came together to copulate, they would intertwine, and then the male would thrust its head into the open jaws of the female, which would in turn bite off the head of the male. The poison that the female consumed then grew into a pair of snakes, which would mature in her belly, and then tear themselves out through the mother, killing it in the process. And because the female did not actually give birth to its young, it was known as, quote, "a viper with no birth pangs." Ignoring the simple fact that snakes lay eggs, Epiphanius took this particular creature and its gruesome reproductive behavior and compared it to a Gnostic sect that allegedly engaged in frequent sex but forbade insemination. Epiphanius attempted to provoke fear and disgust through this image, as he said, quote, "It happens to be the most dreadful and fearsome of all the snakes, since it achieves its own destruction in itself and receives its filth through its mouth. And this deranged heresy is like it." End quote. Thus the serpent and the heretics have become one and the same. And he concluded the entry by saying that he, quote, "crushed its head and body and its offspring with the cudgel excuse me, of life. Although this was verbal violence couched in anti-heretical polemic, the blurred lines between human and animal, heretics and serpent, and the response of the heresy hunter painted a picture of implied physical violence. Panarian 34 described a sect known as the Marcosians, named after its founder Marcos, whom Epiphanius identified as a successor to Valentinus. Irenaeus was the first heresiologist to discuss this heresy in detail, and later both Hippolytus and Epiphanius drew on his account and, as his successors, included the Marcosians in their respective works. All three authors described this heresy with sharp polemic, but Epiphanius also intensified his anti-heretical rhetoric through his use of naturalist imagery. This Marcos apparently combined Gnostic heretical teachings with magical trickery, and he performed regularly in a sort of sleight of hand show to attract followers. At the heart of his spectacle was the manipulation of the physical and chemical properties of certain liquids, which appeared to the audience as magical. In one rite, the Marcosians would prepare 3 chalices filled with white wine, and Marcos would utter an incantation, after which the liquid in the chalices magically changed colors, one red, one purple, and the other dark blue. Epiphanius then quoted an extensive excerpt from Irenaeus that described how Marcos would perform another trick with different liquids that made him appear to be a wonder worker. Marcos apparently focused his manipulative attention on women, usually the best dressed, highest ranking, and wealthiest, convincing them that he had the power to bestow upon them the gift of prophecy, and he used aphrodisiac potions and liquid concoctions to seduce such women. Epiphanius compared the Marcosians with a breed of viper identified as the Dipsas, which he said was known to drink from pools of water formed in rock depressions. The serpent then would secrete its poison into these pools of water, and when an animal approached and drank, it would quickly die. He also described how when a Dipsas struck a human, he or she would feel a burning sensation and severe thirst. The victim would drink and drink and drink and drink until the body vomited, at which point, Epiphanius said, the body expelled not only the consumed liquid, but also the very life of the victim. Thus, Epiphanius cleverly paralleled the unique practices of a heretical sect known for its use of potions and liquids with the fearful effects of the poison of a terrifying breed of snake. And he concluded his reputation by saying that Marcos, quote, causes the death of his dupes with a drink, end quote. Again, I suggest here, serpent and heretic have become blurred. While snakes populated the majority of the entries of the Panarion, Epiphanius did not shy away from other bestial comparisons in his anti-heretical polemic. For example, in his entry against the Valentinians, a Gnostic sect that still had adherents in the 4th century, Epiphanius discussed the proliferation and spread of their heretical teaching and painted the following image. Can we get to the next slide here? Quote, for sowing his dream into many, calling himself a Gnostic, he linked many scorpions into one chain, as it says in the old and famous parable. They say that scorpions linking up one after the other like a chain, up to 10 or even more, will let themselves down from a roof or housetop, and thus with cunning inflict their harm on men. So this man and those derived from him, called Gnostics, have become authors of error. And taking their false ideas from him, each man has become pupil to the other, produced additional error after his teacher, and introduced another heresy clinging to its predecessor. And thus, in a succession, those called Gnostics have been divided into different heresies, having taken their pretenses, as I said, from Valentinus and those who preceded him. Throughout the Panarion, Epiphanius integrated a well-established heresiological theme, that of succession, a concept that was rooted in the Greek philosophical tradition. The appeal to diadochi was a very important tool in the rhetoric of the heresiologists, because it enabled them to classify and marginalize all heretics into a category separate from Orthodox Christians, who understood themselves to be part of an apostolic succession of correct teaching, handed down from Jesus to the apostles and the apostles to the church. Relatively early in the heresiological tradition, Simon Magus, the character in the Acts narrative, who hoped to purchase the miraculous power from Peter and John, became the arch-heresiarch from whom all other heresies descended. The demonically inspired magician passed on his teaching to his followers, who in turn passed their ideas to their disciples. But in each successive step, the heretical teachings were corrupted further and further, like a chain of scorpions linking together to inflict harm upon unsuspecting people. Regarding the Valentinians, Epiphanius concluded his entry by claiming that these scorpions have been, quote, trampled underfoot with the teaching of the truth, end quote. Among the many other heretical creatures were different types of lizards, beetles, hornets, millipedes, louses, toads, stingrays, and even one entertaining comparison with the common mole. All of the examples were characteristic of Epiphanius' rather clever use of natural imagery, but especially that of serpents to intensify his heresiological rhetoric. Snakes had a biblical and theological pedigree whose negative association matched very well Epiphanius' attempts to demonize heretics and heresiarchs. As Ingvild Gilhus argued, in late ancient Christian thought, animals frequently became metaphors for bestial human habits and stand-ins for demonic obstacles that hindered progress in the ascetic enterprise and ultimately in the salvation of the soul. Thus, drawing on the fear of the dangerous side of the natural world and of the manifold threats to the Christian body that pervaded this world, Epiphanius augmented, increased, intensified the soteriological fears of his readers. He appropriated classical knowledge in the tradition of naturalists, much of which would have been familiar, at least anecdotally, to his readers, and he merged it together with the dangerous theology and practice of heretics, thus blurring the difference between human and animals and creating a new heresiological taxonomy. This was Epiphanius at his heresiological and rhetorical best. The late ancient Mediterranean world was no stranger to violence that was manifest in a wide variety of forms, and the ascendancy of Christianity had little ameliorating effect on the ubiquity of violence. Even though Christians in the previous dispensation were occasionally the target of Rome's violent persecution, in the post-Constantinian era, they innovated new motives, means, and methods of acting out their violent impulses. Christians were quite adept at meting out violence upon other Christians. And while the theological controversies and conflicts of the 4th century were predominantly expressed in literary form and voiced at boisterous councilor meetings, there were moments when these disputes spilled into the realm of the physical. The pagan historian Ammianus Marcellinus famously wrote how the Emperor Julian recognized that, quote, "No hostile beasts are as deadly to men as are most Christians to each other," end quote. Thus, when it came to religiously motivated violence, Christians in the later Roman Empire, in a surprisingly short span of time, became quite skilled at justifying and utilizing force, coercion, oppression, and other forms of violent conduct to achieve their respective ends. Michael Gaddis, in his 2005 book, There Is No Crime for Those Who Have Christ, Religious Violence in the Christian Roman Empire, astutely noted that the development of the rhetoric of Christian violence was to a large extent rooted in their experience of persecution and martyrdom in the first 3 centuries of the Christian era. In the post-Constantinian world, the violent memories of the bygone era were preserved in various literary forms, and in some cases reiterated repeatedly by those Christians who experienced renewed persecution at the hands of other Christians, thus creating new martyrs to revere and imitate. Gaddis has provided ample documentation of the fisticuffs, gangster monks, destruction of property, and vandalism, among other forms of violence that pervaded late antique society. Disputes and struggles over theology, ecclesiology, power, and authority all contributed to the widespread utilization of Christian violence, which itself was undergirded by complex rhetorical arguments allegedly based on the discernment and execution of God's will. Deus vult was apparently a rallying cry among late ancient Christians long before the Crusaders ever made their way to the Middle East. Heresiology, the uniquely Christian genre we have examined in the case of the phenomenon, was one such literary expression that was at its heart characterized by polemic and violence, because it tried in no uncertain terms to define and demarcate insider and outsider. Epiphanius' novel taxonomy was one unique expression of this Christian reimagining and redefining of society and culture, and it served to dehumanize the object of his polemical attack. Again, Epiphanius may have been inspired by the very words of Christ. Quote, "See, I have given you authority to tread on snakes and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing will hurt you. Although the original context of this gospel text was referring to the demons cast out by the followers of Jesus, Epiphanius found little trouble in blurring the distinctions between demons, heretics, and venomous creatures, as he invoked the same scriptural reference in his entry against the asp that was the heretic Marcion. By distorting the difference between heretics and noxious creatures, Epiphanius set up one logical reaction to their existence and appearance. While he certainly wanted his readers to be scared and disgusted, he also sought to make them proactive, to take the initiative against heretics, that is, to take action. As I have noted, at the conclusion of almost every entry in the Canonium, beginning with that dedicated to Simon Magus, Epiphanius articulated the success of his heresiological efforts by referencing some sort of violent action, and he did so almost always in connection with one of the noxious animals that he had mentioned. About Simon Magus, Epiphanius claimed that, quote, he has struck this man with the words of the truth. And with respect to Simon's successor, Basilides, he, quote, has crushed this man with the teaching of the truth, end quote. Furthermore, Epiphanius often connected these violent acts with a particular offensive weapon or implement, be it a club or a sandal, which were often endowed with the power of the truth or the gospel or some other powerful modifier. For example, Epiphanius used a reed against the heresiarch Nicolaus, a, quote, cudgel of the faith and the truth against Carpocrates, and the sandal of the gospel against Secundus. Against another heresiarch, Hieracus, Epiphanius claimed that he, quote, tore to pieces his wings and broke his head with the club of life. In other instances, Epiphanius was simply content to use the truth, power, word of God, and the Holy Trinity to refute and crush heretical creatures. Most often in his references to beating or killing various heretical creatures, Epiphanius assaulted their heads. And this image surely invoked the scene of God's judgment against the serpent in Genesis 3:15. Epiphanius never encouraged his readers outright to attack physically any of the heretics he refuted in the Canonium. Rather, through his clever rhetoric, manifest in a novel heresiological taxonomy, which itself had the effect of blurring the difference between man and beast, Epiphanius implied a violent reaction in response to heresy. Thus, the pages of his heresiology contain a literary violence, which left the door open to physical action. He had armed his readers with essential knowledge, frequently embodied in some form of weapon, and thereby empowered the Orthodox to take the initiative, to go on the offensive, to crush, smash, bash, split open, maim, and trample heresy and heretics. Those are all verbs that he uses in the Canonium. Epiphanius himself was never shy or afraid of taking action when he perceived that the Orthodox Church was under threat. And the years following the composition of his Canonium reflected this mindset. He ultimately spent the rest of his years fighting what he thought was an ongoing war for the sake of true Christianity. I wonder, however, if there were particular moments when he could actually wield a club of truth to laugh his enemies. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful paper. Shall we start with some questions from Nicosia and then turn to the virtual audience?
Hope I didn't speak too quickly.
Okay, so the ground's open.
This particular, well, it's part of a chapter of a book that I'm finishing. So when I moved here to Cyprus last year, I began the process of just writing this book, and so I'm not sure when it will come out, but it'll be in print someday.
Αυτή είναι η ερώτηση από το κοινό εδώ αν η σημερινή ομιλία υπάρχει κάπου τυπωμένη, έχει εκδοθεί, και ο Ομιλητής απάντησε ότι κάποια στιγμή θα είναι μέρος της τελικής του δημοσίευσης.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I have two questions, which are probably more general than you might expect. The first one is it clear in this time, in this period, who is heretic and who is orthodox, let's say? And the second question is, I mean, it's very surprising to people like me who have no idea about what's going on at the time, the violence of this language. Do we have cases of such a violence from the side of the heretics? Or is it, I mean, the questions are interconnected, apparently. Or is it clear that he speaks now out of attitude of the ecclesiastic orthodoxy?
Yes, yes. These are great questions. Yes.
So can I translate the question?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Η ερώτηση ήταν ποιος ήταν αιρετικός τελικά αυτή την περίοδο, ποιος θεωρείται αιρετικός και αν η λεκτική βία προερχόταν και από τις αιρετικές αυτές ομάδες.
These are great questions. The first question, do we know who's Orthodox and heretic? In the 4th century, when Epiphanios and others like Athanasios and Arios, these familiar names, were alive, all of these individuals believed themselves to be Orthodox Christians. And so when we use the terms Orthodox and heretic, we are using them from this perspective of the future, looking back at this time. And so yes, the answer to your question is, who was heretic and who was Orthodox? Everyone was heretic and everyone was Orthodox, depending on who they were.
Did his enemies hold positions in the church of that time?
In fact, his enemies were the majority in the Greek East of the Roman Empire. Many of the most famous bishops who he condemned as heretics, for example, Eusebius of Nicomedia, was at the court, or he had access to the court of the emperors. So in fact, the heretic bishops were more powerful than the Orthodox bishops. So this is very much a struggle that's going on at the time. Your second question about violence. So, for example, Athanasios frequently presents the Arian heretics as always committing acts of violence. They destroy churches, they violate virgins, they flog and they beat and they punish Orthodox priests and monks. And so in the rhetoric, in the language, there is always accusations of violence. And that's why it's very important when I say that the rhetoric is what's important here, because the actual physical violence, how intense they were, or how true the accounts, let's say, of Athanasius were, of course, many scholars will be quite skeptical. But we also do know of other occasions when there was real physical violence, rioting, the use of monks as a kind of gangsters. We have sources that tell us that these events actually happen. So again, we must be careful about how much to take seriously, but it's apparently quite a violent society.
Perhaps later on, not in the 4th century.
Well, even at the end of the 4th century, Theophilus, who was the Bishop of Alexandria, he was known to use monks, for example, to clear out his theological opponents from the monasteries in Nitria. And so there is a kind of violence. Yeah.
In Ephesus we have classes in monks.
In the Council of Ephesus.
Okay, yeah, that's right. Sorry. So, to summarize a little bit, κανείς δεν μιλάει αυτή την εποχή θεωρώντας τον εαυτό του αιρετικό. Όλοι μιλούν ως πρεσβεύοντας την Ορθοδοξία και η κατηγοριοποίηση μπορεί να γίνει μόνο κοιτάζοντας από το σήμερα στο παρελθόν. Αυτούς που θεωρούσε ο επιφάνειος αιρετικούς, πιθανώς σε κάποιες περιπτώσεις ήταν και η πλειοψηφία των επισκόπων στην Ανατολή. Και ναι, η βία δεν ήταν μόνο ένα ρητορικό σχήμα, αλλά έχουν και αναφορές και από τις δύο πλευρές για πραγματική βία μεταξύ των δύο παρατάξεων.
Okay.
Very briefly.
To follow in the perspective of the fostering the spiritual with not. Is associated the person with violence. In the context, there is also another situation with people. How is this that even signs would have a big problem association among Christians that actually somebody would consider other Christians the enemies are strong against the devil.
Oh yeah, good question. You need to summarize this for the...
Well, office, το σύμβολο του φιδιού ως αντιπροσωπεύει το κακό, υπάρχει και ένα αντίστοιχο τέτοιο, ένας αντίστοιχος τόπος στην Παλαιά Διαθήκη. Και σήμερα ερώτησες αν είναι δυνατόν η αντίπαλη ομάδα να παρουσιάζεται ως ο δαίμονας.
And the answer to your question is absolutely at this time, the writers like Epiphanius make a strong connection between heretics and the devil. So these men are inspired by the devil, and so their teachings are demonic. So by the 4th century, this association is a very strong, and you're right. This is very, very harsh rhetoric, but it's a way of separating. We are the ones who hold the truth. These people are inspired by the devil, and falsehood and lies. And so it is a very strong rhetoric that Epiphanius uses. Yes.
Ναι, οδηγούνται και εμπνέονται από το κακό, έτσι τους βλέπουν οι αντίπαλοι τους την εποχή αυτή.
Do you know about the symbolism of scorpions and pagan iconography?
Well, the serpent is quite often associated with healing, with the cult of sleepiness and vanity. And so in some ways, Epiphanius is flipping upside down this image, right, where the snake is a symbol of medicine and healing. And he's now twisted the opposite way. So it's a good question, a very good question.
How do you explain this change?
Well, one of the points I tried to make is that Epiphanius is, well, first of all, he rejects anything, or he claims to reject anything of the pagan culture or classical culture. And so he is someone who claims to be biblical in everything that he does. And so I think one explanation is that he is drawing on this biblical, scriptural imagery, and less so from pagan imagery, even if he's familiar with it.
7 minutes on right. Maybe you should have to look at the heart. And no. Inside. No discussion. No discussion. I think that's the discussion.
Well, what about the? Yes. Well, one example that's at least incited is like the naming of images, for example, in Salamina, of pagan gods as Well, it's a very good point, though, is to consult the archaeological evidence here. And maybe cite this, because of the findings of artificial. Yes. Yeah, so, good question.
Να επαναλάβω πιο πολύ την ερώτηση, γιατί δεν ακούγεται. Για το συμβολισμό του φιδιού, είναι κάτι το οποίο συμβολίζει τη θεραπεία στον αρχαίο ελληνικό κόσμο και εδώ έχουμε μια αντιστροφή και αναφορικά με την βία και η ερώτηση υποστήριξε ότι δεν έχουμε ενδείξεις για βία εναντίον αγαλμάτων ή κτηρίων στην Κύπρο. Και εδώ έχουμε κάποια παραδείγματα, πιθανά παραδείγματα από το γυμνάσιο της Σαλαμίνας.
As a follow-up to the question, the previous question, so my impression is that Epiphanes does not reflect a personal social reality. So what does reflect his own readings, the mass of his own readings. So a theological, so to speak, reality.
Yes.
And at the same time, as much as he depersonalizes his enemies, he depersonalized himself. Unlike all other fathers in the 4th century, I think he's the most depersonalized. I mean, he's as a writer at the same time.
So, it's very interesting. So modern scholarship has taken the view that Epiphanios is a kind of fringe figure, that he's so, in some ways, crazy, that he doesn't belong among some of the other greats of the time. But I think, and this is the point I tried to make, is that all his main writings were always, they were written because other people asked him to write these things. And so one of the things I'm trying to show in my book is that rather than viewing Epiphanios as this fringe figure in the 4th century, I think in many ways he is mainstream in the sense that there are a lot of people who thought much like him, whose view of the world and whose religious commitments were really black and white. There are those who wield the truth, and then there are those who do not. And so, as much as he, you're right, in a way, sort of depersonalizes himself, what I think is also operative is that he is representative of a large segment of Christianity, but one that's almost inaccessible to modern scholars because most of the writing, the literary writing that we have that survives, is by the elite, by those who are highly educated, highly skilled, like the Cappadocian Fathers, for example. Whereas Epiphanius, I think, is more a people's bishop. I can't necessarily prove that, but I certainly think that's a hint at why he was so revered in his own day.
Following Stefan's question, I would like to ask, so how typical was Epiphanius as a public figure for 4th century Eastern Mediterranean? I think he's not very typical as a public figure, not as a scholar.
Yeah, especially this heresy hunter image. He is unique in that sense. And maybe in that way he becomes a kind of Orthodox superhero. You know, the guy who goes around the empire and accuses people of being heretic. And so you're right, there is this almost larger than life personality. I don't know if that's kind of what you're hinting at.
But I mean, we have missionaries like John of Ephesus, right? Does he embark on missionaries outside Cyprus, or all this is you know, the world of his readings?
Yes. So he goes on missions. Antioch, Rome, Jerusalem, and Constantinople.
For loving or for hunting?
Exactly. But not going to evangelize, to preach the gospel, but to go and accuse people of being heretics. So it's a kind of anti-missionary in that way. But he does. He travels. And he goes beyond Cyprus to...
Do we know where he goes? Do we know where he goes? I mean, exactly...
Yes. So he, like I said, in Antioch, he travels to Rome in 381, and then to Jerusalem in the 390s, 393, 394, and then to Constantinople at the very end of his life to confront John Chrysostom. And he accuses Chrysostom of being a heretic. Yeah, it's shocking. And in fact, the hagiography, the Vita of Epiphanios, tries to cleanse the Chrysostom conflict. And so it's very interesting because that was a real problem for the reception of Epiphanius. Because he battled against one of the great fathers of the Orthodox tradition, Chrysostom. So,
but what is he aiming at by going to Constantinople and accusing Chrysostom of heresy? What is
his goal? Yeah.
His goal?
That's a great question. It's a lot of maybe a lot of hot air, as we would say in American. He blows a lot of hot air. But yes, you're right.
It takes a trouble to travel to Constantinople.
But often the results of his efforts are not as grand as the words that he uses. And I think that is also a hint at he has no real power in that sense. He can use a lot of words and a lot of wisdom, but he can't get the results that he would want. But if he was, let's say, intimately tied with the emperor and had access to the court or the apparatus of the empire, he could have done many other things, but he couldn't. And so, in some ways, maybe he was very frustrated in his life.
In the case of John Chrysostom, it was a theological foundation of the conference, or it was Epiphanius used because of his loyalty to the political...
Yes, exactly. So apparently, Theophilos of Alexandria, because of this great tension and conflict between Alexandria and Constantinople, used Epiphanius as a tool against Chrysostomos, as a way of saying, you know, Theophilus told Epiphanius, oh, he's an Origenist heretic. You've got to do something about this. But really, you're right, it's a political battle. But, surprisingly, after Epiphanius dies, there's this famous Synod of the Oak, where Chrysostom is in fact deposed. So he did get the result that he might have wanted, but he had already died to see it come to fruition.
Άλλες ερωτήσεις?
I mean, usually members different aspects of one character. I'm not sure, but I think that especially and really Ayanapa somewhere, the great agent.
Yeah.
He is heretical in all secrets, or do we have elements where he some cities, pastoral movement, their nature, as you should.
Yes. His earlier work, the Ancoratus, even though it is also anti-heretical, there is also a strong pastoral feel to it as well. So when he's taking care of his own, he was, a pastor. But it's interesting that you ask about his letters, because we do have one letter. We don't have many from him, but one letter that Jerome had translated, and this is a letter that Epiphanios wrote to John of Jerusalem, and he was attacking John of Jerusalem for being an Origenist. And in this letter, it's quite nasty. So there, it really, I think, depends on his audience. If it's his heretical enemy, he could be just the very nasty. But then to those whom he held dear, he was warm and passionate and shepherding. So he's kind of a split personality in that way.
Κάτι σε σχέση με την Κύπρο και τον Εξάνη.
Just a question. Who told the Spanish himself, the Cyprians? I think we draw conclusions about the position of Cyprus within the framework of Orthodox and
Excellent question. And this is something that I'm working on as well. It's not exactly clear the circumstances in which he became the metropolitan of the island. And Hilarion, and this famous monk, an Orthodox monk, was, from what we understand, a kind of tutor, a teacher at Epiphanius. And so some scholars have suggested that when Hilarion spent the last few years of his life in Cyprus, that was a kind of opportunity to have Epiphanius come. But what I think is more important is that in the 4th century, Cyprus is identified with the Athanasian tradition. So at the bishops at the Council of Nicaea, but then more importantly in other councils that were pro-Athanasius and his theology, the Cypriots are named among them. And this is interesting because the rest of the Mediterranean world at this time, particularly in Anatolia, and Syria, and in Palestine, all of the bishops of those areas, for all intents and purposes, were, from the point of view of Athanasius and Epiphanius, they were heretics. And so Cyprus was a minority place. And so I think that is perhaps the key in also understanding why they wanted someone like Epiphanios to assume the leadership of their community, because they wanted someone who represented their orthodoxy. And Epiphanius was the guy. I mean, he's from Palestine, and it is a bit odd that he comes to become the Bishop of Cyprus, but I think it has to do with his theology. In the hagiography, there are some different stories about why Epiphanius and how he becomes a bishop, but ultimately, it has to do, I think, with theology and some ecclesiastical politics as well, because at the same time in the 4th century, Antioch is, according to the arrangement of the Roman Empire, has authority over Cyprus. And I think Cypriots want to be, as you see in the 5th century, for example, at the Council of Ephesus, they want to be autocephalous. They want to be under no one's authority as far as the church is concerned. But technically, Antioch would have had some kind of legal authority over Cyprus for much of the 4th century. So again, someone like Epiphanius is, I think, the kind of person that they would have wanted to help them become more independent. Now, this is a lot of speculation,
We would like to know more about the political behavior of the Epiphanius, who was, for example, Valens, the Emperor of Valens.
Yes.
So the Emperor of Valens is, according to Valhalla, a Marian.
Oh yes, yes.
A Marian. Yes. And Valens was not present in Constantinople, but in Antioch.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the second half of the 4th century, it seems that politically speaking, yes, the emperors were closer to Arian, to the Arianic heresy, than to Orthodoxy.
Yes. So Constantius and Valens.
Valens and Valentinianus.
So interesting. It's a very good question, because in the Panarion, Epiphanius always presents the emperors as good men. Even Valens, a pure heretic according to his theology. But what he does is he says, these good men have been corrupted by the bishops who surround them. So he uses the emperors even, heretics in his view, really, to attack those heretic bishops. And you're right, this is very much, I think, political and rhetorical as well. Yes.
He has any crimes with all the other bishops in societies at that time.
Presumably.
It was rather more influential, not technically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Salamis, which was in the 4th century destroyed by earthquakes twice, was rebuilt as the city of Constantia. And Constantia was recognized as the metropolitan of the island. In Cypriot history, Salamina and Paphos have always had this tension of who has authority, and this is also true of Christianity. But by the 340s, Constantia was recognized as the one having authority. And so when Epiphanius becomes the bishop in 367, presumably he is the bishop over the entirety of the island as the metropolitan. How much evidence we have of interactions with other bishops of Cyprus is quite limited. There isn't much in the way. But he was apparently beloved by the people of the island, so there's something to be said about that. But you're right, that's a good question. But he is the metropolitan.
Stefan, δεν υπάρχουν άλλες ερωτήσεις. I'd like to thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Once again for all this, the discussion. And our next meeting is next Tuesday. Η Dr. Άννα Μπαλιάν παρουσιάζει τη δουλειά της πάνω στη σχέση του Βυζαντίου και του Ισλάμ, σχετικά με την τέχνη του Βυζαντίου, τέχνη του Ισλάμ. Θα δοθούν τρεις διαφορετικές ομιλίες από την κυρία Μπαλιάν. Η πρώτη, την Τρίτη, θα είναι στο Βυζαντινό Σεμινάριο, την Τετάρτη στην Τηλεγώνια και την Πέμπτη άλλο ένα τηλεσεμινάριο στο πλαίσιο της L35, του μαθήματός μου. Λοιπόν, σας περιμένουμε για την επόμενη εβδομάδα.
Να πάρει και